Hey challengers, so we're back here. We're going into tier 4 of our Nutrition for Body Change series. And the good news is we're moving up to some more intermediate and advanced nutrition strategies. The bad news is as we get up to these top 2 tiers, we start to get into an area where there's a lot of noise in the nutrition industry. Focus on this, do this is what matters. And my hope for this lecture is that I can weed out 3 things that really aren't worth our time to focus on, as well as give you 3 things that are worth your time. I'm going to throw up this infographic right now. I think this is just so true as far as how we feel. Sometimes we're so focused on these little things that the industry is telling us to do or to not do, and we end up really missing our target altogether. I would argue that if we have a sustainable approach, we have a sleep, stress, hydration managed, and we have good caloric balance, 95% of our clients could actually see their goals just with those 3 tiers. But we will go ahead and jump up into tier 4. I'm going to go ahead and throw caloric balance on the screen because that's going to be the base that we're building off of. So once we've got our calories where we need them, either a calorie deficit for fat loss, a calorie surplus for muscle gain, or just calorie maintenance for recomposition performance, we need to take the next step up. And that next step up is adequate protein intake. So from the research out there, we can see really anywhere from a low end of about 0.6 to 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight, all the way up to the higher end of 1.2 grams of protein per pound of body weight, have made a difference in improving body composition, particularly with a calorie restricted or calorie deficit type approach. Now, why is this the case? Well, there's really 3 reasons why we know protein is an important macronutrient. The first one is that protein helps support our lean muscle. Lean muscle, even if our goal is predominantly fat loss, is key for keeping our resting metabolic rate strong, as well as managing hormone levels in the body. The second reason why protein is important is because it's a very satiating nutrient. When we take protein in, we generally feel fuller and it's easier to follow our hunger cues. And then the third reason is protein has a high what we call thermic effect of food. So it actually takes our body energy to digest and break down the food that we eat. Protein happens to have a thermic effect of about 25 to 30%, meaning that if you ate 10 grams of protein and that was 40 calories, it would take us an additional 10 calories, or about 25% of that energy, to actually digest and break down that protein. If you compare that to carbohydrates, which are in the neighborhood of about 5 to 10% thermic effect, and then fats, which are 0 to 3% thermic effect, you can see why protein has an advantage. Now, once we're consuming this base intake range of protein, that's where the science really starts to fly away, and it becomes more of a matter of preference between carbohydrates and fats. Now, there are certain things like insulin sensitivity, certain things like personal preferences, digestive function, that sort of thing that can play into what we select. But the bottom line is there's plenty of studies out there with a lower fat, moderate carb approach that lead to really good fat burning results, as well as other studies whose protocols have been more higher fat, low carbohydrate that have also produced really good results. I love how Avatar Nutrition does it because it really just allows you to assign a preference when you're in there and say, hey, you know what, right now in this phase I want to eat more carbohydrates, or in this phase I want to go a little bit lower carbohydrate, and it allows your macros to be set based off of that preference. There's really no magic potion here, no secret sauce as far as macro breakdown. Once we have that protein established, we know, hey, we've got to find out what's going to work for us and what's going to be sustainable for us over time. So we've gone ahead and filled in the rest of our calories with carbohydrates and fats. The last element we want to look at is really a subsection of the carbohydrate category, and that is our total fiber intake. Just like protein, fiber is the other piece that seems to run through the research and have a consistent positive effect on body composition and fat loss outcomes. And we're not quite sure why this is, but one of the factors that may be at play is fiber's help with our digestive health, in particular the bacteria that are involved in breaking down and absorbing our food. The other piece is that fiber is very satiating, much like protein is. So our fruits and our veggies there generally help keep us fuller longer, and that may also play a role in positive outcomes. A recommended intake for fiber is just to make sure you're getting up to this minimum threshold of about 20 grams. Now, for larger individuals, those over 200 pounds, may be better to be up in that 25 to 30 range is kind of a minimum threshold. But as long as you're over that 20 gram range, that generally is adequate or sufficient. So if you're tracking, that's pretty easy to do. If you're a non-tracker, that really just comes down to making sure you're hitting your fists of vegetables throughout the day, as well as trying to incorporate other fiber-rich foods into your meals. So maybe you've got a palm of protein, your fist of vegetables, and maybe you add some beans or legumes as your carbohydrate source. So we've got through what matters, and now we're going to flip the script a little bit and get into what are really three of my pet peeves when it comes to the nutrition industry and the way things are promoted. And I'm not going to say that these three things don't matter at all, because that wouldn't be true, that wouldn't be the case. But what happens is our industry shines such a bright spotlight on these that it almost feels like a minefield just trying to navigate them. And really, when we go back and look at the impact overall, it's nothing in comparison with some of the base tiers that we've had already. So I'm going to jump right in. The first one, and I guarantee I'll get some questions on this one, is sugar/insulin. So there seems to be this idea out there that somehow eating sugar or eating foods that spike our insulin is somehow more powerful than our calorie balance or even our focus on some of the stuff that we talked today with our protein and fiber intake. So in summary, I'm not saying that you should load up your entire diet with a bunch of refined sugar, or even that efforts to remove some of the refined sugars in your diet aren't well founded. What I am saying is if you enjoy a dessert or a sweet treat that happens to be a little bit higher in sugar, it's not automatically flipping you into fat storage mode. In fact, it would take a significant calorie surplus combined with repeated insulin spikes to really create an environment in which you're going to store a good amount of body fat. Number two is this idea of bad foods, or these industry villains that we need to cut out of our diet in order to see progress. And the two that come to mind are bread and dairy. Now, there may be good reasons. Maybe you have an allergy, maybe you have an intolerance, it causes you digestive issues or inflammation. Those would all be good reasons to look at maybe removing one of those from your diet. But cutting dairy or bread out of your diet is not going to be the magic cure that separates fat loss from fat gain or weight gain. What happens is the calorie balance equation still applies. Protein is still a valuable nutrient. We know actually that dairy is a really good source of bioavailable protein. So the take-home message here is don't just go axing stuff out of your diet because somebody said you should do that. In fact, narrowing the focus, or basically narrowing the food groups that you can consume, makes it much more difficult to adhere to a diet, makes it more difficult to sustain that approach, and ultimately can be more negative than it is positive. So third and final pet peeve is this idea of meal frequency. And again, I'm going to revert back and say that I'm not saying that meal frequency has no impact. But what does really bother me is this idea that meal frequency, eating more meals throughout the day, somehow stimulates our metabolism. So the reason why when we eat food our metabolism increases is what we talked about earlier. There's a thermic effect of food. Energy it takes our body to digest and break down that food. Now, if we eat 400 calories and they're a mix of, let's say, protein, carbohydrates, and fats, we may have a 10% thermic effect of food average for that meal. So, in essence, we would essentially spend 40 calories of that 400 digesting and breaking down that food. Now, let's say we eat that 400 calorie meal 5 times a day. So that would be 2,000 calories. We're going to spend 200 of that digesting and breaking down that food through the thermic effect. Now let's say we take that 2,000 calories and eat it in 2,000 calorie meals. The thermic effect of that food has not really changed. The thermic effect of that food is still going to be the same 200 calories or 10% of that 2,000. So while there may be beneficial advantages to eating small meals throughout the day as far as your appetite, as far as your schedule, as far as your ability to eat or get all your calories in, it really isn't related to boosting your metabolism. So the main point here is I hope this is a little more freeing for you as far as not feeling like you have to adhere to a really strict regimen of 10 meals throughout the day. Do what works with your schedule, do what you can be consistent with, and do what you can adhere to, and I think you'll see great success. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I know there's a lot of topics in here, even some controversial ones, so we'd be happy to chat more if you guys have questions.